Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Is it here? Beautiful countenance. Good morning, Cedarfield. Our newspaper lady, Julie, told me that we get here every morning.
Turn it up.
230 copies of the Times-Dispatch. So I'm sure you can understand why our speaker today needs no introduction. But I'm going to introduce him anyway. Jeff Shapiro has been covering Virginia politics for almost 41 years. He is clearly the dean of journalists in this field. Now, if you have turned on the TV lately, you may have seen some political ads. Maybe. It seems that there is an election 2 weeks from today here in Virginia. Even the talking heads of the national news, cable and national news outlets are talking about how important this election is to both parties. Well, I assure you, Jeff knows 3 or 4 times as much as any of them. And knowing Jeff, he will agree with me. So we're very fortunate today to have him here with us at this special time. Please welcome Jeff Shapiro.
Good morning. Thank you, David. It's lovely to be back in the countryside. It occurred to me as I was leaving this morning, truly no offense intended. My mother lives in the western Canterbury. Here I am at Cedarfield. It's as if I'm visiting the collegiate schools versus, St. Catherine's and St. Christopher's. But I think, if my added memory serves, that rivalry, at least on the gridiron, has been settled. This year, am I correct? The Cougars won? That as it may. David made reference to my tenure, for lack of a better word, and how long I've been doing this. And I can assure you, anything that I may have picked up along the way has to do with hanging out with the likes of some of your neighbors at Grimsley, Jan Malone. What I do has largely to do with endurance and very little to do with ability. So I hope you'll bear with me for a few minutes. Of course, it is a Virginia gubernatorial election, and even in a greatly changed state like Virginia, one in which the majority of people who live here are non-natives, present company included. Is that better? I don't know, excuse me. This is an election that while we choose someone who lives, walks, and works among us, a governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general, this is in an election that is increasingly national in its tone and its context. Again, in large part because of what Virginia has become. And as well, a suburban-dominated state. 2/3 of the people who live in Virginia, more than 2/3 of the people who live in Virginia, live in metropolitan areas, cities and suburbs, most of them in the eastern half of the state. It's a dramatic change, and it's one that's taken place over a lifetime. When Ed Grimsley was a boy in Southwest Virginia, not that long ago. Let's hear it for Grundy. 2/3 of the people, just as an example, 1945, the first gubernatorial election following the Second World War, 2/3 of the people who lived in Virginia then lived in the countryside. remarkable change over a single lifetime, and characterized as well by dramatic changes in our economy. By 1945, largely as a consequence, or in part a consequence of the global conflagration of the Second World War, Virginia's economy was dominated by manufacturing. Not too much earlier, it had been an agricultural economy. Fast forward to the second decade of the 21st century, Virginia's economy is one that is dominated by service industries, knowledge industries. There is more money made in Virginia today managing things, increasingly for the federal government, than there is manufacturing things. And to give you an idea just how cleaved at the hip we are with federal government, an entity routinely decried as fiscally irresponsible by Virginia politicians. About 30% of the gross state product, almost a third of our economy, is attributed to federal largesse, indirect and direct. So, like it or not, Virginia is, as Bill Godwin said in his first inaugural, of the nation. And so it is on that stage that this campaign unfolds. And I think it can be said that the gubernatorial nominees, the major party gubernatorial nominees, are very much a reflection of contemporary Virginia. Democrat Terry McAuliffe, a non-native New Yorker, my sin as well. When he first ran for governor in 2009, this is his third campaign for governor. It could be his second successful campaign for governor, which would make him the Mills Godwin of the 21st century. We can talk about that a little bit later. He emphasized his deep roots in Virginia, in that least Virginian part of Virginia, Northern Virginia. By God, he and his wife Dorothy, he said, had lived in the same house for 20 years. Some of you may remember when Chuck Robb ran for lieutenant governor in 1977. There was a great deal of suspicion about Robb, Lyndon Johnson's son-in-law. He was parachuting into Virginia, standing for statewide office, had never had any elective experience. How cheeky of him. Well, Robb and wife Linda traveled to Virginia, and in Mrs. Robb's, I would say, handbag, but figuratively speaking, was a genealogical chart that showed that Robb's roots in Virginia reached back to the colonial era. He was as purely Virginian as they come. You may remember that Marshall Coleman, Republican candidate for governor in 1981, running against Robb, tried to make it an issue of the fact that Robb was not a native Virginian, to which Robb replied, having been born in Phoenix, Arizona, I was with my mother at the time. So much for Terry McAuliffe, is kind of a non-native. I think he is arguably an emblem of Virginia. Glenn Young, the Republican nominee, I think the same could be said of him. Having made his fortune, he is a half-billionaire, depends on how the market is doing that day, in the finance business, the private equity business, one that can be enormously lucrative, and if you're on the receiving end, it might cost you your job. Perhaps you've seen some of the ads that have been run against Glenn Young, largely by the labor unions. But in these two candidates, I think we have, again, reflections of contemporary Virginia. And also, I think in these candidates, less so in McAuliffe having already been governor, but particularly in Youngkin, and we've seen this in other candidates, Democrat and Republican. We have a potential governor who, because of his considerable personal means, has chosen to finance his own campaign. I think that was one of the reasons he was so attractive to Republicans who have been sort of out of the game on a statewide level since, well, 2009 is the last time a Republican was elected governor statewide in Virginia. That Republicans have tried pretty much everything to get back in the game. They've tried Trump sound-alikes and Corey Stewart. They've tried freedom fighters in Ken Cuccinelli. They've tried Washington insiders in Ed Gillespie. And now they are trying essentially an empty vessel who can pay his own way. By the way, about 40% of the money that the Youngkin campaign has spent so far in this campaign came out of Mr. Youngkin's pocket. An estimate by Forbes magazine is that this represents about 4% of his personal fortune. I'm reminded of a bumper sticker that was seen in West Virginia in 1980 when Arch Moore, a Republican, ran for governor against a Democrat by the name of John Davison Rockefeller IV, J to the peasants. Mr. Rockefeller reached deep into his purse to finance his campaign. Republicans weren't going to take it lying down, circulated a bumper sticker that read, "Make him spend it all, Arch." Frankly, I'm surprised that we haven't seen a similar bumper sticker in Virginia. But I say that Youngkin is an empty vessel in that, and I hope that we can sort of segue into the campaign itself, with the nuts and bolts of the campaign, in that his wealth is appealing to, say, more traditional Republicans who seem fewer and fewer in number, who see personal prosperity as a sort of an emblem of the party's commitment to low taxation and light regulation. And he likes to talk about how fortunate he has been in the business realm. But I don't need to remind you that the 45th President of the United States remains an enduring presence in our politics, even in a state that twice rejected him, once by 5%, the second time by 10 percentage points. And that within the Republican Party, what Donald Trump says carries a lot of weight. This means that Mr. Youngkin has to pay a measure of deference to Mr. Trump. This is the very narrow path that he is walking. And so what one hears from Glenn Youngkin is essentially Trump light. It's sufficiently Trumpy that it keeps the Republican base sated, satisfied, engaged. But to his credit, it is for the most part, coupled with some very nice manners. Frankly, Mr. Youngkin shows well. And I think that is one of his other attributes, and that perhaps is something that has generated a measure of appeal among independent voters, many of them Republican-leaning, a number of whom have essentially hidden out during the Trump years because they just couldn't bring themselves, as a number of regular Republicans couldn't, to support Trump. Flashback to the Mesozoic era, last June. And you'll recall on your television seeing lots of ads about this lanky fellow with a slightly wounded tone of voice shooting baskets. That was Glenn Youngkin. Of course, there was never any mention that he was a Republican, God forbid. Oh yes, by the way, he is running for governor, and I would sure like to consideration, but he wanted to make the introduction first. And I think through those ads, there was a very deliberate attempt to sort of represent him as the nice guy next door. And that this is someone for whom you would vote regardless of party because he's friendly, welcoming, interested. And I think that's the, kind of the third element of the Youngkin candidacy on which this rookie rich guy's ambitions rest. Throughout the Trump era, Virginia Democrats have prospered. Lots of people turned out to vote not for Democrats, but against Republicans, largely because of their anger, fury, and distaste for Donald Trump. This long Democratic win streak, at least of this era, goes back to 2016 when Hillary Clinton carried the state by 5 percentage points. In 2017, previous gubernatorial election, Democrats swept the statewide offices, brought in a huge number of legislators. It was an election in which there was a spectacularly high turnout for a gubernatorial election. You say that, 47%? Nearly 1 in 2 voters turned out. But that's important because in Virginia, and this is just a reminder of how this state has changed, when more people participate, the stronger the state's large D Democratic reflex. My friend Tom Van Auken, originally at Chesterfield, I think will vouch for me. I suspect that one of the reasons he's here is when you feel a little runoff from Chesterfield, having seen what's happened to the vote on the other side of the river. Well, bluing. I'm not sure it's going to go blue in this election, though I suspect it will be competitive. I don't know if Tom feels any more comfortable in Western Henrico, given that it too is bluing. Feeling a little intrigued already. I say that with love, respect, and admiration. And so, 2018, the Democrats handily reelected the United States Senator Tim Kaine, who was running against Corey Stewart, that Trump mimic. Democrats restore their majority in the U.S. House delegation, including electing a Democrat from the 7th District of Virginia, formerly represented by Mrs. Cantor's son. Good to see you. 2019 legislative elections, Democrats take back the General Assembly, restoring majorities in the House and Senate. 2020 presidential year, Biden carries Virginia by twice the majority that Hillary Clinton had in 2016. And here we are, 2021. Virginia, one of 2 states that chooses a governor in the year immediately following a presidential election. The other is New Jersey. And if it's weird, it happens there. But that campaign is largely written off as a Democratic hold. So Virginia is the state on which the nation's eyes are riveted. And mind you, a lot of this has to do with the fact that we're across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C., a place where there is a bumper crop of national political reporters. And what better way to write a story about those amusing provincials on the edge of the Upper South and cross the Potomac and affix a pricelessly exotic dateline like Fredericksburg to their stories and tell the outside world about the mini referendum going on in Virginia that will test what's going on or not in in Washington. But again, I think because of this campaign, because of what our Commonwealth has become, a lot of these national stories are not terribly misguided, that they are truly snapshots of what is a national campaign writ small. Just consider the issues and how they have affected the arc of this campaign. And I don't reel these off in order of importance. Donald Trump and Trumpism, if you will. These remain. Polls bear this out. Conversations with our friends and neighbors bear this out. That concern and worry and in some respects support for the former president and some of his ideas are very much on people's minds still, even though he is out of office. A state in which women are, as they are in the nation, in the majority. And while abortion rights is not necessarily an issue that is exclusive to women, and I think that it is often overstated as an issue of appeal to women, look what happened in Texas and see how that has affected the debate in this campaign. Also out of Texas, it's even easier now to carry a firearm, openly carry a firearm in Texas. Could it become even easier in Virginia, which is a so-called open carry state? Again, all of these things taking place beyond our borders, but nonetheless driving the conversation within them. So, what do you do? If you're a non-native, if you're a come here, and maybe politics, Virginia-style politics, is somewhat new to you, perhaps you've come here from a state where there's party registration, which Virginia hasn't, which has straight ticket voting, which Virginia hasn't. Practices that tend to reinforce, a tribal reflex, if you will. Then I would suggest that the partisan affiliation of candidates for the largely uninformed becomes a very powerful cue for voters. And so this is one reason why, it's not the only reason why, that Terry Mcauliffe keeps making the connection between Donald Trump and Glenn Youngkin. And frankly, Glenn Youngkin wouldn't be howling in his, cheerful sort of way about this if he weren't concerned that the connection is being made. And mind you, this is something he has brought on himself. For example, you have seen the ads, he has said this in public, doesn't say it quite as often as he used to, how he is honored by Trump's endorsement. And that one of the reasons he is running for governor is because he shares so many of Donald Trump's values and concerns. And Terry Mcauliffe wasn't joking when he said that for months on Glenn Youngkin's website, the only proposal that had been posted in any detail was his promise of a study of election integrity. This is, of course, one of the ways in which Youngkin bows to the Trump vote. Now, in politics, I used to hear this a lot from the old timers at the Capitol. You don't hire a challenger, you fire an incumbent. Now, in Virginia, that's rather tough to do since Virginia is the only state in which a candidate for governor is prohibited from succeeding himself. And one day, I hope, or herself, say that. I think these campaigns are essentially blank slates when they begin. That's not quite the case this go around, because Terry Mcauliffe served as governor from 2014 to 2020. And like Mills Godwin, who was elected the first time in 1965 as a Democrat, and then was elected a second time in 1973 as a Republican, Terry Mcauliffe was viewed within the Democratic Party as the strongest, most technically proficient, most experienced candidate the party had. And I would say that if you looked at the primary results, it was a pretty convincing endorsement. Nearly 500,000 votes were cast in the Democratic primary. That's not quite as many as were cast in the 2017 Democratic gubernatorial primary, when 540,000 votes were cast and Ralph Northam was nominated. But Terry Mcauliffe not only prevailed in a field of 5 candidates, he got 61.2% of the vote, and he carried every jurisdiction, every locality in Virginia. Glenn Youngkin, in contrast, was nominated in a drive-through convention. Again, we have the backdrop of COVID, which is also a huge factor in this campaign. We have a Democratic candidate who believes in vaccine mandates, mask mandates. We have a Republican candidate who doesn't, who says, well, you know, I got vaccinated, you want to do it too. But, you know, it should be required, but just don't call for me. And so we have this kind of thinly attended Republican convention. We were told that there could be as many as 54,000 people participating. There were 31,000. Not inconsequential, but less than a tenth of the participation in the Democratic primary. Which leads me to another point, one that is ultimately determined by what will drive this campaign, and that is turnout. I think it is safe to say that Democrats have in Virginia now a structural advantage. A structural advantage defined as more Virginians identify as members of the Democratic Party than of the Republican Party. Structural advantage in that jurisdictions such as Fairfax, the largest one in the state, followed by Prince William County, the second largest in the state, along with Arlington County, the most urban suburban county in the state, and increasingly Loudoun County. These are jurisdictions in which not only do Democrats win, or they have won, but they win overwhelmingly. Again, all these communes, all this generational change, all of this diversity, all of which have fueled the Democratic ascendancy, and all of which are going to be tested in this first post-Trump election. So can Virginia's continuing growth, albeit slow, its continuing suburbanization, really accelerated, and its heightened diversity. 42% of Virginians are non-white now. When I moved here, Hispanics and Asians had a negligible presence. Virginians, for the most part, were either black or white. Can those factors alone keep Democrats aloft? And to give you an idea just how lopsided this has become, There are approximately a dozen counties and cities in Virginia with populations of 200,000 and above. The largest being Fairfax County with almost 1.5 million residents. If Democrats carry those jurisdictions, and in recent elections they have swept them all, and they include Henrico, City of Richmond, Chesterfield County. If Democrats sweep them all, 10 to 12 counties and cities, there aren't enough votes left in the state for the Republicans to catch up. Welcome to the New Virginia. I'm just going to wrap up with water here. I'm just going to also ask if anyone had any questions at this point. I'm much more interested in what you all have to say than I possibly could. I was hoping to touch on some of the secondary and tertiary races as well as the campaigns for the legislature. I think the campaigns for the legislature are particularly interesting because if you see the election in Virginia as, say, some Republicans have described it, and even a couple of independents, as sort of a test of wokeism, those legislative races are really an important measure of that. Because post-COVID, post-George Floyd, with these Democratic majorities, we have seen the Virginia General Assembly, often a place where good ideas, for the most part, go to die, is adopting all sorts of things that might strike people as just sort of inconsistent with the character of Virginia. For example, open, unrestricted early voting for 45 days before an election. That means every day is an election day. A remarkable change from a commonwealth in which the Constitution authorized poll taxes and literacy tests that were intended to eliminate not just blacks as a political force in Virginia, and they did, but poor whites as well. Laws that were intended to preserve the muscle, the political sway of the oligarchs, who weren't much on representative democracy, even though they said they practiced it, and who were content telling Virginians what was best for them. So fast forward to 2021, 2020. Not only do we have all of these unrestricted voting practices, we have lots of new restrictions on firearms. That bit of business is not complete yet as far as the Democrats in the legislature are concerned. And post-George Floyd, steps being taken to require, I guess it depends on one's perspective, greater accountability by law enforcement. By the way, Democrats are very sensitive to the notion of defunding the police, whatever that means. If you look at state spending in recent years, funding for police and law enforcement actually has increased in Virginia. We see as well a greater sensitivity to Virginia's diversity. The General Assembly of Virginia mandating that local governments take steps to protect LGBTQ students. And I don't know how many Fox News viewers are in this room. Might I ask for a show of hands? Tom, please. You don't have to be shy. Fox News viewers. Oh my. Fox is 20 So then you know all about what's been going on in Loudoun County. All right? How parents aren't given an adequate say in the public educations of their children. How critical race theory, whatever that is somehow being taught in Loudoun County schools, and how allegedly a boy in a skirt attacked an adolescent gal in a public school, and that it was hushed up and kept secret for months. These are data points in the Youngkin campaign, by the way, that Fox News and the conservative press have been content to keep at full boil in behalf of the Youngkin campaign, and for the following reason. Youngkin's ambitions hinge on a lower turnout. Youngkin's ambitions hinge on a robust rural Republican vote, and Youngkin's ability to hold down what is presumed to be a heavy Democratic turnout in Northern Virginia. And so he is spending a lot of time talking up this Loudoun County thing in hopes of grabbing a slice of the Northern Virginia vote. Early in the campaign, when Glenn Youngkin was candidate for the nomination, he was telling people that his research indicated that if he could pull 42% of the vote in Northern Virginia, roughly, that paired with a robust Republican vote in the usual Republican strongholds could elect him governor. We will see. Those legislative races to which I have referred, there are a couple in the area that are being watched closely. Democrats want to hold their majority in the House of Delegates. The Republicans have fielded a number of challengers in hopes of taking back the House. Schuyler Van Valkenburg, a Democrat, was among the targeted. I suspect he's going to have a fairly easy re-election in the end. Rodney Willett, he's in a grudge match with Mary Margaret Castleberg. That is one on both parties' radar screens. There's the Roxanne Robinson race in Chesterfield County. There's an open seat in Colonial Heights that was held by the former Republican Speaker, Kirk Cox. Republicans believe they have a strong candidate, Mike Cherry, and can hold that seat. There's a seat down on the North Carolina line, represented by Rosalind Tyler, a black Democrat. The area has become more strongly Republican, though it went blue, largely because of the way the district was drawn for president. But because of its rural nature and, shall we say, the cultural sensitivities of rural voters, Roz Tyler is the only member of the House Democratic Caucus who gets a pass on voting against, voting for gun restrictions. She is a steady, reliable no vote on gun control, and that is strictly a matter of an attempt at political survival. There are some seats in Virginia Beach as well that are contested, and there are one or two on the fringes of the Washington area that are being watched, as well as one out in Southwest Virginia. The level of competition for the legislature is intense. Nearly every seat is contested, which I would think is going to generate additional interest and enthusiasm and perhaps contribute to turnout on both sides. A little bit of trickle-up voting, if you will, as opposed to trickle-down. So the legislative races are important. But then, too, are the secondary and tertiary statewide races for lieutenant governor and attorney general. We're going to have a woman in statewide office come January. It'll be the first time since 1994 when a woman was elected statewide for the first time. Mary Sue Terry, a Democrat, elected attorney general, twice elected attorney general, defeated for governor in 1993. Not only will we have a woman as lieutenant governor in 2022, we will have a woman of color. The Democratic nominee, Paula is a mixed parent. She identifies as Afro-Hispanic. She's from Prince William County, mentioned the second largest county in the state, and one in which, if you are a white guy, you're in the minority. By the way, Fairfax County is a majority minority jurisdiction now as well. The Republican nominee for lieutenant governor is Winston Sears, a black woman who was in the House of Delegates representing the city of Northam, briefly ran for Congress, was defeated, then sort of dropped from sight and then reappeared this year as a candidate for lieutenant governor. She's living now in Winchester. She is, she family operates a plumbing contracting business. And then the candidates for attorney general. Mark Herring, a Democrat, is seeking a third term. I think he will match John Saunders, who was attorney general in the mid-20th century for the number of terms held by an AG. His opponent is Jason Miyares from Virginia Beach, of Cuban ancestry. So we're seeing levels of diversity in candidates that are truly a reminder of how multicultural Virginia has become. Now, you all have your own voting precincts here, but I bet a bunch of you have been voting early. So maybe a show of hands on those. All right, so from September 17th forward, okay. The rest of you going to be voting on election day, or don't tell me, you have felon records and you can disenfranchise. So anyway, again, mindful of the time, I'm much more interested in what you all have to say, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Dr. Bryan.
Jeff, you mentioned the governor's position. Do you think the governor will ever have the ability to succeed himself? Second question, what is the future of Governor Northam? Political future.
Thank you, Charlie. Virginia is the only state in the country in which a governor is prohibited from serving consecutive terms. The last state to do away with such a term limit, Kentucky, did so in the 90s. I'm reminded that Virginia was also the last state to adopt elective school boards. And the reason I mention that is because there was some thinking at the time that maybe that was an inappropriate step for the government to take. And I think some of the thinking then might, with some, apply now. There was a delegate from Buckingham County in the Piedmont, slightly south and west of Richmond. His name was Claude Anderson. He was the chairman of the House Elections Committee. And this is going back many years. Northam covering some things, and there was a meeting of his committee concurrent with a summer meeting of the bar. At the time, by the way, the majority of legislators were lawyers. So this was deemed an appropriate way to kill a couple of birds with one stone. So the committee was convened by Chairman Anderson, and he announced the purpose of the meeting. He said, the chair would observe, he would say, of elected school boards, that just because 49 other states do it doesn't mean it's right. There are some people who believe that that should guide the debate over doing away with Virginia's prohibition on a governor succeeding himself or one day herself. Why do we have that? When Virginia went to direct election, popular election of its governors in 1851, remember, this was a state in which power was reserved for the few, and the few wanted to keep it that way. And the few knew, and certainly history showed, that for the most part, there was a continuum in leadership. That one conservative white guy from the countryside after another conservative white guy from the countryside after another conservative white guy from the countryside was going to occupy the governorship. So that was one of the ideas behind this restriction. And a close examination of contemporary Virginia politics will indicate that every governor has tried to leave his or her mark on this place, and if you will, sort of disrupt that continuum. Frankly, Charlie, I am surprised that with the Democrats having restored their majority in the legislature, that they did not begin to take steps to do away with that restriction. Perhaps once the ordeal of redistricting is behind us, I don't know how close you all have been following that. It's like watching monkeys play games with hand grenades. It's just not productive. That if there is a Democratic governor and a Democratic majority in place in the legislature, presumably in place for a decade, that restriction will be done away with. As for fellow VMI alumnus Ralph Northam, who has demonstrated a remarkable durability given the calamity that afflicted him on February 1st, 2019, the short end of which is the blackface scandal. I prefer to call it the blackface calamity. Scandal sort of suggests, handcuffs and people bursting into bedrooms and catching folks on flagrante delicto. Governor Northam is going to return to Northam and practice medicine. It is not his interest in seeking elective office again. So unlike, in this case, the Institute will not be heard from again. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for sharing your information with us. It's a vast knowledge. Jeff, thank you so much for sharing your vast knowledge with us and doing it so fairly. Those of us who've been watching the polls still question the validity. Which one should we be watching and believing? And what are really the main issues between Republicans and Democrats this election?
Polling. I'm glad you brought that up. I tend to view polls as curiosities, snapshots in time. I don't think of them as predictors, but I would concede that because we are barraged with them, they can have a conditioning effect on people. Well, they will hear, oh, well, so-and-so's ahead. You know, I want to vote for a winner. One of the problems that we've seen with polling, forgive me for using the third person plural, but I think I can speak with some confidence to my colleagues in this bracket. How do you prepare in an era of mobile communications, an accurate sample of the population at large? I bet a lot of you still have landlines, right? No? Okay. And you also, yeah. Well, I still have a landline, and I really, I don't get anything that approaches a consequential call on my landline anymore. So this has been a problem. The polling wizards will tell you that they think they've come up with ways to address this. So that's one of the question marks that continues to hang over public opinion polling. Another is, and I would suggest the 2016 presidential election is an example of this. All of the polls indicated that Hillary Clinton had only to show up. I mean, not even Donald Trump was anticipating winning the presidency. But I think a lot of that can be tied, if only for purposes of this conversation, to polling. So hear me out. How polls are conducted and how questions are asked also have an effect on results. So, for example, I'm sure we all know a lot of people who were very outspoken in their support for Donald Trump. But I suspect we all know a few people who weren't. And who weren't for reasons of what a psychologist would call social acceptability. In the 2016 presidential election, polls in which the respondent, whoever was answering the phone, was not interviewed by a real, living, breathing person, but instead had to mash a key on his or her phone to answer a question, yes or no, Trump or Clinton. Those polls, the ones in which there was no human interaction, if you will, there was no chance of shame or embarrassment, those polls consistently showed Donald Trump ahead. Consistently. But they were largely overlooked. So, I guess I would say to you, polls are to be viewed and handled gingerly. I'm sorry, your other question was about the issues and this campaign for governor. And maybe the issues that aren't being discussed or are getting the short shrift. I can think of a couple, and they are issues that often get people into the weeds, which in politics, certainly in campaign politics, one wants to avoid, because in politics it's said if you're explaining, you're losing. Taxes. Not that they're too high in Virginia. I'm sorry, Virginia is not a high tax state. But Virginia has an antiquated tax system. I mean, where else? Well, there are other states that do this, but increasingly fewer states do this. Why would a government continue to impose a tax on a physical thing, automobiles, that are continuously declining in value? When the personal property tax, which is reserved under Virginia's Constitution for local government, when that was put in place in the colonial era, and I hope that Dr. Bryan, historian, will vouch for me on this, hard assets were important and telling measures of wealth. In a state with a service economy, a knowledge economy, where people are paid a lot of money just for knowing things, it seems to me there's got to be a better way, a more reliable way, but an equitable way to harness that wealth for the public good, or part of that wealth for the public good. So the tax system is desperately in need of an overhaul. But that's not going to happen until we get rid of the prohibition on a governor not being able to serve an consecutive term. And that's because any attempt to modernize the tax system is going to require the full support of the chief executive. And that becomes a harder issue to discuss at a time when Virginia's economy has bounced back, strongly bounced back from the pandemic, but there are clearly trouble spots. And a measure of that is this amazing surplus approaching $3 billion. Some of that also has to do with federal largesse, the COVID rescue plan. But taxation, which affects everyone, is one issue that is getting very little conversation. In fact, at essentially the Labor Day, pre-Labor Day period of the campaign, Glenn Youngkin tried to use taxation as a way to generate some additional interest in his canvassing. And if you've noticed that he's not talking about it, that should tell you that he knows, based on what he's hearing from people, based on the polling his campaign is conducting, that taxation is not necessarily the hot issue that it has been. Think about, in terms of personal property tax, in 1997, Jim Gilmore from Enrico, a Commonwealth's attorney, an attorney general, was elected governor in a landslide, promising to do away with the personal property tax. But as an exercise in messaging, it was remarkable. Jim Gilmore reduced his principal talking point to 3 syllables: no car tax. And if one considers the enormous amount of time that we spend doing other things, that the competition for our attention, particularly when it comes to a political message, the simpler, maybe the more trivial, the better, because that increases the likelihood that what the politician is saying will somehow get through all of that noise, all of that static. And in 2021, that's why Terry McAuliffe is running around saying Glenn Youngkin equals Donald Trump.
Thank you, Jeff. It's noon and we really don't have any more time, but we do appreciate all of you that came today. Our next focus group lecture will be the 3rd Tuesday of November. I can't remember the date. And we will have a panel discussion with our own Fred Beck and Dr. Charles Bryan. So we hope to see you then. Thank you very much, Jeff. I think